Princess Anne has just detonated the most seismic family confrontation Windsor Castle has witnessed in a generation, storming across a marble corridor in front of stunned aides and staff to publicly order Queen Camilla out of a private family gathering after the Queen Consort reduced 8-year-old Prince Louis to trembling, silent tears over a single sentimental lapel pin, a tiny enameled swallow that had once belonged to Princess Diana herself. The Princess Royal, the woman who has spent 5 decades as the crown's most disciplined soldier, the daughter who never breaks ranks, the aunt who never raises her voice, the sister who has swallowed every institutional humiliation with granite composure, finally shattered every unwritten rule of Windsor decorum in the space of 90 devastating seconds. She broke a sacred oath of silence she had held since the summer of 1997. She broke a solemn promise made to a dying sister-in-law in a Paris hospital corridor. She broke the iron code of the firm that had governed her entire adult life. And she did it because a small boy, her great-nephew, the youngest son of the future king, had been made to cry over a pin the size of a thumbnail. What exactly did Princess Diana whisper to Anne in the final private conversation between them? A conversation Anne has never once acknowledged in 29 years of public life. Why did the late Princess of Wales explicitly forbid a specific senior courtier from ever being permitted near her sons or grandsons, naming him in a handwritten codicil sealed with crimson wax? And what dark, long-suppressed tragedy from the corridors of Kensington Palace finally compelled the most stoic woman in the Windsor bloodline to place herself, at 75 years old, directly between a frightened 8-year-old and the ruthless machinery of the palace she had served her entire life? The gathering had been convened in the oak drawing room at Windsor, that cavernous, hauntingly quiet chamber where the late afternoon light filters through mullioned windows and pale amber shafts, catching the dust motes as they drift lazily above the Persian rugs. It was a Sunday in the autumn of the year, the sort of crisp, biting afternoon when the grounds outside are frost-dusted and the great-grandfather clock in the corner ticks with the deliberate, funereal cadence of an institution that has outlasted empires. The scent of aged paper and beeswax polish hung in the air, mingled faintly with the distant aroma of Earl Grey being poured in an adjoining pantry. Van Dyck stared down from the eastern wall, his painted eyes seeming to follow every movement in the room, and the gilded ceiling above shimmered with the flickering warmth of a hearth fire that had been laid at dawn by a footman whose name none of them knew. It was, by every outward measure, an ordinary family Sunday. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat with her hands folded on her lap in the pale blue armchair by the window, her posture immaculate but her eyes tired. Prince William stood at the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the marble, his gaze drifting toward his youngest son with that quiet, watchful protectiveness that had grown more pronounced in recent months. George and Charlotte were seated on the settee near the far wall, whispering to one another about something unimportant. And Prince Louis, 8 years old, small for his age, dressed in a navy blazer that had been tailored only weeks earlier, stood shyly by his father, his small fingers reaching up now and again to touch the lapel of that blazer, to touch the tiny enameled swallow pinned there. The pin was no larger than a shilling. Its wings were spread mid-flight, painted in the palest cream and silver, with a single droplet of deep sapphire enamel at the throat. It had been William's gift to Louis 3 days earlier, presented in a small burgundy velvet box in the study at Adelaide Cottage. Louis had opened the box with the careful reverence of a boy who somehow already understood that grown-ups sometimes gave gifts that meant more than they said. It was Granny Diana's, William had told him, kneeling to his son's eye level, his voice softer than Catherine had ever heard it. She wore it when she was a little girl. She wore it the day she married your grandpapa. And she wore it in the last photograph anyone ever took of her with me and Uncle Harry. I want you to have it. I want you to know she's with you, always. Louis had said nothing at first. He had simply stared at the small silver bird for a long moment. Then he had lifted his eyes to his father and asked, in the direct, unfiltered way of children who have not yet learned the crown's elaborate language of evasion, "Papa, is she watching me?" And William, who had not cried in front of his son in years, had turned his face away for a moment before answering, "Yes, darling, she's always watching you." Louis had asked to wear the pin every day since. Camilla entered the oak drawing room at 4 minutes past 3. She was dressed in a soft dove-gray suit, her hair immaculate, a triple strand of pearls at her throat, and she carried with her that particular air of settled, hard-won authority that she had cultivated over 2 decades of gradual, painstaking acceptance into the innermost sanctum of the firm. She greeted Catherine with a light kiss on both cheeks. She nodded politely to William. She smiled indulgently at George and Charlotte, and then her eyes fell upon Louis, upon that small navy blazer, upon that tiny silver bird glinting quietly in the afternoon light. And something in the Queen Consort's expression, some subtle tightening around the mouth, some barely perceptible flicker in her pale blue eyes, changed. She crossed the room with unhurried grace. She stopped in front of the boy. She lowered herself slightly, though not so far as to kneel, and she said, in a voice that was gentle but unmistakably firm, "Louis, darling. That pin. I'm afraid it isn't appropriate for today. Protocol, you see. We can't have unofficial ornaments at family gatherings. Take it off, there's a good boy." The room went still. For 29 years the world has spoken for Diana Frances Spencer. For 29 years, courtiers and biographers and documentary filmmakers and gilded institutional apparatchiks have interpreted her, reframed her, sanitized her, weaponized her, and occasionally, when it suited them, resurrected her ghost for a photo opportunity beside a landmine or a leprosy ward. But there has never, in all those 29 years, been any such protocol as the one Camilla invoked in the oak drawing room that Sunday afternoon. There is no rule, written or unwritten, in the ancient constitutional labyrinth of the House of Windsor that prohibits an 8-year-old prince from wearing a lapel pin gifted to him by his own father at a private family gathering. There is no clause in Debrett's, no codicil in the Lord Chamberlain's office, no whispered convention passed down from equerry to equerry that would forbid a small boy from carrying a token of his late grandmother on his own chest, in his own family's drawing room, on his own quiet Sunday afternoon. The protocol did not exist. It had never existed. It was invented, in that moment, out of the pale air of a Windsor afternoon, by a woman who had made a specific and deliberate choice about a specific and deliberate object. Louis's small hand rose slowly to the pin. His fingers hovered over it. He looked up at Camilla. He looked across the room at his father. And then, because he was 8 years old, and because he had been raised to obey his elders, and because he understood in some inquiet, aching way that a queen had just told him to remove the last thing his father had given him that had belonged to his grandmother, his lower lip began to tremble. He did not cry immediately. He was, after all, a Windsor. He had been taught, in the small ways children of the firm are always taught, that tears are things to be swallowed. But his eyes filled, and one enormous glistening tear broke free and slid, unchecked, down his soft, pale cheek. His fingers fumbled at the pin's clasp. He could not undo it. He tried again. His hands were shaking too badly, and still Camilla stood over him, her expression composed, her hand held out patiently, waiting. Catherine half rose from her chair. William took one step forward, and in that suspended, terrible half-second before either parent could intervene, the door at the far end of the oak drawing-room opened, and Princess Anne walked in. She was dressed, as she almost always was, in a plain herringbone skirt and a cream silk blouse, her hair pinned back with the same practical severity she had worn since 1974. She carried a small leather folio under one arm. She had come, she had told her private secretary that morning, only to drop in briefly before her equestrian meeting at 4. She had not expected to stay. She had not expected anything. But she saw, in the space of a single breath, everything. She saw Louis's trembling hand. She saw the tear on his cheek. She saw William's stricken face. She saw Catherine half rising. She saw Camilla's outstretched, waiting palm. And she saw, glinting in the pale amber light, the tiny silver swallow, the pin she had last seen in July of 1997, pinned to the lapel of a woman standing on a hospital steps in a black jacket, waving farewell to a photographer she did not yet know would be the last to capture her alive. Anne set the leather folio down on a side table with a quiet, deliberate click. She crossed the room in 6 measured steps. She stopped between Camilla and Louis, and she said, in a voice so low and so cold that Catherine would later describe it as sounding like a blade being drawn from a scabbard, "Take your hand away from him." The color drained from Camilla's face. "Anne," the queen consort began, "there's no need to. Take your hand away from the child." Camilla's hand lowered. Anne knelt. She was 75 years old, and she knelt with the ease of a woman who had spent a lifetime in the saddle, and who had never once, in 7 decades of public duty, cared what any courtier thought of her posture. She knelt in front of Louis, and she took his small trembling hands in her own weathered ringless ones, and she said, in a voice suddenly softer than any of them had ever heard from her, "Louis, darling, look at me." He looked at her. His enormous blue eyes were still swimming. "That pin," she said, "is not to be removed. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, unless you yourself decide to take it off. Do you understand me?" He nodded, unable to speak. "It was your grandmother's, and your grandmother was the bravest, kindest, most loving woman I ever knew, and she would want you to wear it, and I want you to wear it, and your papa wants you to wear it, and no one is going to tell you otherwise. Is that clear?" He nodded again. A second tear fell, but this one different, a released tear, an exhaled tear. Anne pressed her thumb gently against his cheek and wiped it away, and then, still kneeling, still holding the child's hands, she turned her head slowly, deliberately, to look up at Camilla. "Well, you will leave this room. You will leave this house. You will not attend the remainder of this gathering, and you will not, so long as I am drawing breath, ever again speak to any child of William and Catherine's about protocol that you have invented on the spot to serve whatever small petty jealous impulse rose up in you when you saw that pin. Do you understand me?" Nobody in the oak drawing room breathed. 20 million people were not watching this live. There were no cameras. There were no encrypted feeds. There were no satellite uplinks trembling against a palace communications lockdown. There was only the great-grandfather clock, ticking with its funereal cadence, and the crackle of the hearth fire, and the soft, ragged sound of an 8-year-old boy trying to steady his breathing. And yet within 72 hours, the story would be everywhere. Within 72 hours, in pubs from Edinburgh to Truro, pint glasses would freeze mid-air. Within 72 hours, the servers of every major British broadsheet would groan under the weight of a nation demanding to know what, precisely, had happened in that room. Because Windsor Castle, for all its stone and all its silence, has never once in 1,000 years been able to keep a secret that a footman witnessed. But that is later. That is aftermath. Return for a moment to the room. Return to Anne, still kneeling. Return to Camilla, her face now the color of old parchment, her pearls trembling almost imperceptibly at her throat. Return to William, whose hand had risen unconsciously to cover his mouth. Return to Catherine, whose eyes had filled with a decade's worth of unshed tears of her own. Return to George, 10 years old, sitting perfectly still on the settee, understanding without being told that he was witnessing something that would shape the rest of his life. Return to Charlotte, who had reached for her older brother's hand, and return, above all, to that pin. That small, silver, sapphire-throated bird, still catching the amber light on the lapel of an 8-year-old boy who did not yet understand that his great-aunt had just done, on his behalf, what no one in the firm had been willing to do for his grandmother. Camilla left the room. She did not speak. She turned, with the wounded dignity of a woman who has been publicly indicted in the one language she cannot counter, and she walked out through the same door she had entered by 4 minutes past 3. Her footsteps receded down the marble corridor. A door closed somewhere distant, and then the oak drawing room was quiet again, save for the clock, and the fire, and the small, hitched breathing of a boy in a navy blazer. To understand what Anne did, to understand why a woman who had spent her entire adult life as the Crown's most reliable soldier chose that Sunday afternoon to break every rule she had ever held, one must go back. One must go back to a summer that had never fully left her. One must go back to July of 1997, to a private sitting room at Buckingham Palace, to a conversation that had never been recorded, never been transcribed, never been so much as whispered about in any biography of any member of the House of Windsor. Diana had come to see Anne. It was a strange visit. The two women had never been close. They had circled one another for 16 years with a wary, mutual respect that had never quite blossomed into friendship. Anne had thought Diana theatrical. Diana had thought Anne cold. And yet on that afternoon in July of 1997, 6 weeks before Paris, Diana had asked, through a mutual aid, for a private meeting. Anne had agreed. Diana had arrived alone, without a lady-in-waiting, wearing a cream linen dress, and Anne would remember this detail for the rest of her life. A small silver swallow pinned to her lapel. She had sat down opposite Anne in a pale green armchair. She had accepted a cup of tea. And she had said, without preamble, "Anne, I need you to promise me something." Anne had raised an eyebrow. "That depends entirely on what it is. If anything happens to me," Diana had said, and her voice had been steady, entirely steady, in a way that would haunt Anne for the next 29 years. "I need you to look after the boys, not officially, not in any way that would cause a fuss, but when it matters, when something happens that they cannot fight themselves. I need to know that you, Anne, not Charles, not the Queen, not any of the courtiers, will stand between them and the men in grey." Anne had set her teacup down very slowly. "Diana, what are you talking about?" Diana had smiled then. It had been a strange smile, thin and knowing and impossibly tired. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You've watched them your entire life. The men in the charcoal suits, the men with the clipboards, the men who never appear in any photograph but who decide, in the end, every single thing that happens to any of us. They will come for my boys after I'm gone. And they will come for their children. And they will come, most of all, for whichever child they decide is the softest, the youngest, the most sensitive, the one who reminds people most of me. Because that child will be the greatest threat to them. That child will be the living proof that I was not what they said I was." Anne had stared at her. "Diana, are you unwell?" "No," Diana had said, "I am extraordinarily well, which is precisely why I am telling you this now, before I am not." She had reached into her handbag then. She had drawn out a small cream-colored envelope, sealed with a droplet of crimson wax bearing the Spencer crest. She had placed it on the small mahogany table between them. "This is not to be opened," she had said, "unless one of my sons or one of their children is directly harmed by a member of this family in a way that cannot be undone. Do you understand? Diana, do you understand, Anne?" And Anne, because she was Anne, because she had spent her entire life understanding things that other people refused to see, had reached across the table and taken the envelope, and she had said, "Yes, I understand." Diana had smiled again. She had risen, she had crossed the room to the door, and there, with her hand on the brass handle, she had turned back and said, "Thank you. And Anne, one more thing, the swallow." She had touched the tiny silver pin on her lapel. "It was my mother's, and her mother's before her. It will pass to William, and from William to whichever of his children he believes needs it most. And when you see it again, because you will see it again, you will know that the moment has come. You will know that everything I told you was true, and you will know what you have to do." And then she had gone. Anne had never opened the envelope. It had sat, for 29 years, in a locked steel drawer in her private study at Gatcombe Park, beneath a stack of unremarkable estate correspondence. She had thought, on many occasions over those 29 years, that she would go to her grave without opening it. She had thought, on some level, that Diana had been unwell that afternoon after all, grief-stricken, exhausted, paranoid in the particular way that women married into the firm often become in the years before they are finally, quietly discarded. And then, on that Sunday afternoon in the oak drawing-room at Windsor Castle, Anne had walked in and seen a tiny silver swallow on the lapel of a trembling 8-year-old boy. And she had known, with the mathematical, terrible precision of a prophecy fulfilled 29 years to the season after it had been made, that the moment had come. The rain had begun to fall against the mullioned windows. Somewhere in the distance a phone was ringing. It was Anne's private secretary, a woman named Margaret whose surname will not be recorded here, calling from an antechamber 3 floors above. Margaret's hand, when she lifted the receiver, was trembling so violently that she had to steady her wrist against the desk. She had not been in the oak drawing-room. She had not needed to be. Word travels through Windsor the way fire travels through dry heather, silently, invisibly, and with a speed that outpaces every official channel. A footman had told an under-butler had told a housekeeper had told a lady-in-waiting, and within 11 minutes of Camilla's departure from the room, 3 separate senior members of household staff were placing 3 separate telephone calls to 3 separate parties, none of whom would ever admit, in the days and weeks that followed, that they had been the source. Margaret was calling Anne because Margaret had received a call, in turn, from a man whose voice she had recognized instantly, a man whose voice had chilled her, as it chilled everyone who heard it, in the particular way that only certain voices in the firm can chill. He was the senior courtier. He had no title that appears in any published court circular. He had served, in one shadowy capacity or another, since the late 1980s. He was the man Diana had named in her sealed envelope. He wore, without variation, a charcoal suit, polished Oxford shoes, and a wristwatch so understated that it took a trained eye to recognize its value. He carried a clipboard. His eyes were cold. He had been in every room where every decision that had ever mattered to the House of Windsor had been made, and he had been in no photograph of any of them. He was the invisible architect. He was one of the men in gray. And he was, in that moment, on the telephone to Anne's private secretary, demanding to know what, precisely, had happened in the oak drawing-room. Margaret said, because Margaret was loyal to Anne and to Anne alone. "I have no information, sir." "You will have information," the voice on the other end of the line said. It was not raised. It was never raised. That was, perhaps, the most terrifying thing about it. "You will have information within the hour, and you will convey to Her Royal Highness that a discussion is required, this evening, at her earliest convenience." "Her Royal Highness," Margaret said, "will determine her own convenience." There was a pause, and then the voice said, very softly, "Margaret, you have served this household for 18 years. Do not, at this late stage of your career, make the mistake of thinking that Her Royal Highness's convenience is a matter over which you have any influence." The line went dead. Margaret sat, for a full minute, with the receiver still in her hand. Then she replaced it in its cradle. Then she picked it up again and dialed Anne. Downstairs, Anne had risen from her kneeling position beside Louis. She had squeezed Catherine's shoulder as she passed. She had exchanged a single wordless look with William, a look that Catherine, watching, would later describe as containing more shared history than any photograph in any album had ever managed to capture. She had picked up her leather folio, and she had walked, without hurry, out of the oak drawing-room and up the marble staircase to her private apartment on the 2nd floor. There, she closed the door. She walked to the small mahogany writing desk beneath the window. She unlocked, with a small brass key she wore on a chain beneath her blouse, the top right drawer. She reached inside, and she drew out, for the first time in 29 years, a cream-colored envelope sealed with a droplet of crimson wax bearing the Spencer crest. She held it in her hands for a long moment. The wax was still intact. The paper had yellowed only slightly. She could still smell, faintly, the ghost of Diana's perfume. White gardenias, always white gardenias, clinging to the fibers as though the past 29 years had been only a long strange afternoon. Oh, she broke the seal. The wax cracked with a small sharp sound that seemed, in the quiet of the room, as loud as a gunshot. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of pale blue writing paper, folded twice. Anne unfolded it. Diana's handwriting, that unmistakable, looping, slightly leftward slanting hand, filled the page. It was dated the 14th of July, 1997, and it read, "Dearest Anne, if you are reading this, then something has happened to a child of William's or Harry's that could not be prevented by ordinary means, and the moment I feared for 20 years has arrived. You will already have guessed the name of the man responsible. I will not write it here, because I will not give him even the courtesy of ink. He has been at this since before Charles and I were engaged. He was the one who arranged the isolation, the one who arranged the surveillance, the one who arranged in the end the accident that we both know was not an accident. He is still there. He will still be there when you read this. He will look older. He will look kinder. He will have new titles and new letters after his name. But he will be the same man, and he will be doing the same thing to the same family, and he will not stop until someone in this family with the courage and the standing to do it stands directly in his way and tells him, in front of witnesses who cannot be silenced, that he is finished. That someone, my dear Anne, is you. It was always going to be you. I knew it the first time I met you. You are the only one of them who was never afraid of him. Go and finish it. And tell my Louis, because I know it will be Louis. I have always known it will be Louis. He is the one who will wear the swallow. Tell him that his granny is watching, and that his granny is proud, and that his granny loves him more than any letter or any pin or any silver bird could ever say. With love, always, Diana." Anne read the letter twice. She folded it. She placed it back in the envelope. And then, in a gesture that no one saw and that she would never speak of, she pressed the envelope briefly to her lips. She reached for the telephone on her desk. She dialed a number that only 3 people in the world possessed. When the voice on the other end of the line answered, the voice of the senior courtier, the voice of the man in the charcoal suit, the voice of the man Diana had named, Anne did not offer any greeting. She did not observe any of the elaborate courtesies that had governed her every professional interaction for 50 years. She said, simply, "I have the letter. It is dated the 14th of July, 1997. It names you. It details your involvement in 3 specific incidents, including one in August of that year. I have arranged for certified copies to be lodged with 3 separate solicitors and 1 journalist whose identity you will not be able to discover in time. Your resignation will be on my desk by 6 o'clock this evening. You will retire to your estate in Herefordshire. You will not appear in any public capacity involving any member of this family again. If you do, the letter will be released in its entirety. Do you understand me?" There was a very long silence. Then the voice on the other end of the line said, in a tone Anne had never heard from it before, a tone stripped of every ounce of the granite composure it had worn for 4 decades, a tone that sounded, suddenly, like the voice of a very old and very frightened man. "Anne, please. You do not understand what you are." "I understand perfectly," she said. "I have understood for 29 years. 6 o'clock. Do not be late." She hung up. She sat, for a long time, in the pale afternoon light, with the letter in her hands and the rain still falling against the mullioned windows. She did not weep. She had never been a woman who wept. But she closed her eyes, and she thought of a summer afternoon in July of 1997, and of a woman in a cream linen dress with a small silver swallow on her lapel, and she said, very softly, to the empty room, "It's done, Diana. It's finally done." Downstairs, in the oak drawing room, William had knelt in front of his son and had gathered the small boy into his arms and had held him, without speaking, for several minutes. Catherine had joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them. George and Charlotte had drifted over silently and had leaned against their parents. And Louis, his small face pressed into his father's shoulder, had whispered, in a voice muffled by wool and by relief, "Papa, is Auntie Anne cross with me?" "No, darling," William had said, his own voice thick. "No, Auntie Anne is not cross with you. Auntie Anne is not cross with anyone in this room." "Then who is she cross with?" William had thought about this for a long moment. And then he had said, choosing his words with the care of a man who had waited his entire adult life to be able to answer this question honestly, "She is cross with somebody who hurt Granny Diana a long time ago, and she has finally been able to do something about it. And that is a good thing, Louis. That is a very, very good thing. Louis had nodded slowly against his father's shoulder. He had thought about this. And then, in the way of 8-year-olds who understand more than the adults around them ever quite believe, he had said, "Then Granny Diana will be happy." "Yes, darling," William had said, and his voice had cracked at last. "Granny Diana will be very happy indeed." Outside, the rain was steady now. It drummed against the mullioned windows in a soft, ceaseless rhythm, the way rain has drummed against those windows for 400 years. The grandfather clock ticked, the hearth fire crackled, and on the lapel of a small navy blazer, a tiny silver swallow with a sapphire throat caught the last amber light of a Sunday afternoon in Windsor and glittered, quietly, as though it were breathing. The senior courtier's resignation letter was delivered to Anne's desk at 6:04 that evening. He did not sign it in his own hand. He had a private secretary do it for him. It was a single paragraph long. It cited health reasons. It made no reference to any conversation, any letter, any incident, any pin, or any child. It was accepted without comment. Within a week, his name had been quietly removed from 3 separate court circulars, 2 royal committees, and 1 advisory board. Within a month, his London flat had been vacated. Within 6 weeks, he had retreated to his estate in Herefordshire, where he would live, in near total seclusion, for the remainder of his life. He never spoke to a journalist. He never wrote a memoir. He never, so far as anyone could determine, spoke of the matter to another human being. He simply vanished, as men of his kind sometimes do, into the pale, quiet countryside from which they had originally emerged, taking his charcoal suits and his polished Oxford shoes and his clipboards with him. The story of what had happened in the oak drawing room began to leak within 72 hours. It leaked, as such things always leak, in fragments. A footman had told his sister. His sister had told her husband. Her husband had told a friend at the pub. The friend at the pub had a cousin who worked as a picture editor at a Sunday tabloid. By the following weekend, the front page of that tabloid carried a photograph of Prince Louis, taken at a public engagement the previous month, with the tiny silver swallow on his lapel circled in red, and beneath it the headline, "Anne's Fury, Princess Royal Kicks Camilla Out Over Diana Pin." The story ran, in various forms, in every British newspaper for 11 consecutive days. Buckingham Palace issued no comment. Clarence House issued no comment. Kensington Palace issued no comment. Anne, when approached by a reporter outside a horse trial in Gloucestershire, offered only a single sentence: "Family comes before protocol. It always has, it always will." She walked on. She did not answer any further questions. She has not, in the months since, spoken publicly about the matter again. Camilla did not attend the Christmas gathering at Sandringham that year. It was announced that she was unwell. She recovered in time and returned to public duties in the new year, but her interactions with the Wales children became notably more careful, more distant, and, several observers noted, more overtly warm, in the practiced way of a woman who has been publicly corrected and does not intend to be corrected again. She has not, so far as anyone knows, ever again invoked a protocol that does not exist. And Louis wears the pin still. He wears it to school. He wears it to family gatherings. He wears it to church. It has become, in the months since that Sunday afternoon in Windsor, the single most photographed lapel pin in the world. Children across Britain have begun to wear small silver bird pins on their own school blazers, in a spontaneous, unorganized gesture of solidarity that no palace press office has been able to either encourage or discourage. Diana's swallow, the pin her mother gave her, and her mother's mother before that, has at last flown free. On a quiet evening some weeks after the incident, Anne drove herself, alone, to Althorpe House. She was let in by the current Earl, her nephew by marriage, who asked no questions and offered no observations. She walked, in the fading light, to the small island in the lake where Diana had been laid to rest 29 years earlier. She stood at the edge of the water for a long time. The evening was cool. The scent of white gardenias, planted along the shore in Diana's memory, drifted faintly across the still surface of the lake. Anne drew from her coat pocket the cream-colored envelope. She looked at it for a long moment, and then, with a small, deliberate motion, she tore it into 4 pieces, and then 8, and then 16, and she let the fragments fall into the water, where they drifted, slowly, out toward the island, and sank at last beneath the still, dark surface. She stood there until the light was entirely gone. Then she turned, and she walked back to her car, and she drove home to Gatcombe. She has never spoken of the letter. She has never spoken of Diana's request. She has never spoken of the senior courtier, or of the resignation, or of the 29 years she carried the envelope in her locked drawer. When asked, in a rare interview many months later, whether she felt she had done the right thing that Sunday afternoon at Windsor, she considered the question for a long moment, and then she said, simply, I did what any aunt would do. I stood between a child and someone who was hurting him. There is nothing more to it than that. But there was, of course, more to it than that. There will always be more to it than that. There is, in every family, and perhaps most of all in the strangest and most gilded family in the world, a moment when someone who has kept a promise for 29 years finally, at long last, keeps it. And when that moment comes, the promise itself does not appear on any front page, and it does not appear in any court circular, and it does not appear on any list of official engagements. It appears, if it appears at all, only in the small, quiet, private gesture of a great-aunt kneeling in front of a trembling 8-year-old boy and telling him, in a voice that has finally, after 5 decades of granite composure, permitted itself to be gentle, that his grandmother is watching, and that his grandmother is proud, and that no one, so long as she is drawing breath, will ever take his grandmother away from him again. The broadcast, had there been a broadcast, would have cut to black here. There was no broadcast. There was only a Sunday afternoon in autumn, and a fire in a hearth, and a clock ticking in the corner of an ancient room, and a small silver swallow with a sapphire throat catching the last amber light on the lapel of a boy who did not yet fully understand what had been done for him, but who would, in time, come to understand it, as all the children of Diana Frances Spencer come, in time, to understand what was done for them, and what was not. The truth had saved her boy's boy. The swallow had finally flown free. The secret was out. And across Britain, in pubs and in kitchens and in living rooms, in the strange hushed way that certain stories travel when they touch something old and deep and true in the national soul, people set down their glasses, and they turned to one another, and they did not quite know what to say. They only knew that something, at last, had been made right.